For 31 days, 2-year-old Caylee Anthony was missing, and nobody outside her family knew. That's the detail that still stops people cold. Not a few hours, not one terrible night. 31 days. By the time Caylee's grandmother, Cindy Anthony, finally called 911 in the summer of 2008, the story was already twisted up in lies. Caylee was a toddler from Central Florida, living in the humid sprawl outside Orlando, when neighborhoods run together and afternoon storms roll in fast. She was bright, playful, and the kind of little kid people noticed right away. Then she was gone, and when police started asking the most basic question, "Where is Caylee?" the answers didn't bring them any closer to her. At first, Caylee Anthony, Caylee's mother, said a babysitter had kidnapped her. She gave police a name, Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, often shortened to Zanny. It sounded specific enough to be useful, the kind of lead detectives could grab onto and start chasing. But almost right away, the story started falling apart. The addresses didn't line up. The jobs Caylee mentioned didn't exist. People who were supposed to fit into this story had no idea what detectives were talking about. The whole thing had a strange quality to it, like it had just enough detail to sound real from a distance, but the second anyone stepped closer, it came apart. And Caylee kept going. At one point, she took detectives to Universal Studios and claimed she worked there. She moved through the building with enough confidence that for a while, it looked like she belonged. She led officers past hallways and office space as if she were guiding them through her own workplace. Then the lie ran out. She admitted she didn't work there at all. It was one of those moments that burned itself into the case, not just because she lied, but because of how far she was willing to carry the lie before stopping. Detectives weren't dealing with a small mistake or a panicked mix-up. They were watching someone hold up an invented version of reality until the exact second it could no longer stand. By then, suspicion had started to harden. This no longer looked like a desperate mother trying and failing to explain a chaotic situation. It looked like something else, something colder. To understand why the case exploded the way it did, you have to go back to the people at the center of it. Caylee was living inside a family that stayed close, argued often, and carried the kind of tension that can sit under the surface for a long time. On paper, it should have been a safe world for a child. A young mother, grandparents nearby, family all around. But once police started pulling at the story, the whole picture felt unstable. The first shock was the silence. 31 days is almost impossible to hear without asking the same question everyone else asked back then. How does a 2-year-old disappear for that long before authorities are called? That question followed everything. It followed the false babysitter story. It followed the fake details. And it followed what investigators found when they started looking at the family's home, their computers, their trash, and Caylee's car. The car became one of the most argued over pieces of the entire case. Witnesses described a smell coming from the trunk that they said was so foul it was impossible to ignore. Some believed it smelled like decomposition. Later, people argued hard over what that smell really was and what it proved. But once that detail entered the case, the trunk stopped being just part of a vehicle. It became a place everyone kept coming back to. Because if something terrible had happened to Caylee, investigators believed the truth may have passed through that space. While police were trying to figure out where Caylee was, another part of the story was building in public. People were watching Caylee, and what they saw made the case even harder to process. Photos surfaced showing her out with friends. She had been seen at bars and clubs during the period when Caylee had not been reported missing. In one image that spread everywhere, Caylee was smiling in a party scene under the words, "hot body." That photo became one of the most unforgettable images tied to the case. For a lot of people, it seemed to capture the part they could never understand. A little girl was gone, and her mother did not appear to be tearing through the city trying to find her. She appeared to be living her life. That's when public anger really took off. Some cases build slowly. This one didn't. It hit one of the deepest fears people have, a missing child, and a mother whose behavior seemed to clash with every instinct people expected to see. Still, at that point, Caylee was officially a missing child. That changed in December 2008. Months after the search began, a utility worker found skeletal remains in a wooded area not far from the Anthony home. It wasn't some distant hiding place at the edge of another town. It was close, ordinary, exposed to the weather. The remains were identified as Caylee Anthony. And suddenly, the case was no longer about where she might be. It was about how she died, who was responsible, and whether the state could prove it. There was duct tape associated with the skull area. That detail would become one of the most fiercely argued points later in court. Prosecutors saw it as part of a murder case. The defense fought over what it meant and whether it proved what the state said it proved. Nothing in this story stayed simple for long. Once Caylee's remains were identified, prosecutors moved ahead with a devastating theory. They charged Caylee Anthony with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and multiple counts of providing false information to law enforcement. Their argument was blunt. They said Caylee wanted freedom from motherhood and killed Caylee so she could live the life she wanted. To support that theory, they pointed to the lies she told police, the month-long delay before Caylee was reported missing, the trunk evidence, internet searches on the family computer tied to chloroform, and Caylee's behavior during the time her daughter was gone. The defense answered with a completely different version of events. They suggested Caylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool. They also said the family, especially Caylee's father George, had taken part in covering up what happened afterward. At the same time, they attacked the prosecution's forensic claims. Their job was not to prove exactly what happened in every detail. Their job was to stop the state from proving murder beyond a reasonable doubt. And that set the stage for one of the most closely watched trials in the country. By the time the case reached trial in 2011, it had already become a national obsession. Every day seemed to bring another disturbing piece of testimony. Jurors heard about the computer searches, they heard about the duct tape, they heard about the remains, the trunk, the lies, and the shifting timelines, but they also heard the defense challenge almost every major point. That matters in a criminal trial, not in the emotional sense, in the legal one. Outside the courtroom, millions of people felt sure they knew what had happened. They kept coming back to Caylee, to those 31 days, and to Caylee's behavior while her daughter was missing. To many people, guilt felt obvious. Inside the courtroom, obvious was not enough. The jury had to decide whether the state had actually proven murder. That is a much narrower question, and in a case this emotional, it was a question that many people outside the legal system had no patience for. They weren't measuring uncertainty the way jurors had to. They were measuring grief, instinct, and outrage. Then came the verdict. On July 5, 2011, Caylee Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, and aggravated child abuse. She was convicted only on the counts tied to lying to law enforcement. For a split second, the reaction was almost stunned silence. Then the shock hit. Outside the courtroom, the response was immediate fury. Commentators, viewers, and parents across the country reacted as if the justice system had failed in the most painful way possible. A child was dead. Her mother had lied repeatedly. And still, the jury said the state had not proven murder. That was the part many people could not get past. But the legal answer and the public answer were never the same thing. Legally, the verdict meant the defense had done what it needed to do. It had carved out enough reasonable doubt to stop the prosecution from crossing the final line. Whether people agreed with that was another matter entirely. And that's why this case never really settled. It stayed alive in the space between what much of the public believed and what a courtroom could actually establish. For some people, Caylee Anthony became the face of a mother who escaped justice. For others, the verdict stood as an example of what can happen when a prosecution leans on a theory it cannot fully lock down with proof. Either way, the central wound never closed. A little girl died. The full truth of exactly how it happened still feels buried under lies, family conflict, and one of the most divisive trials in modern American history. That may be the coldest part of this story, not just the death itself, but the silence that came first. Before the courtroom arguments, before the television coverage, before the verdict that split the country, there was Caylee Anthony, a small child whose life should have been measured in birthdays, family photos, and the ordinary little moments nobody thinks to treasure until they're gone. Instead, her name became attached to a case people still argue about more than a decade later. And even now, when people think back on it, they usually return to the same question they had from the start. How was she gone for 31 days before anyone outside that house was told? As always, visit us at readtherealstory.com for more unbelievable true stories. Until next time, stay curious.